for example, and say there is a term called Pramana Shastra, which I can use, which is some people would refer to for philosophy, your words like darshana, your words like tattva shastra, and so on. So one might say, I have these words which are present in Indian languages, which refers to the idea of philosophy, which captures the concept of philosophy. Then what is it that these people mean when they say Indians did not possess the idea of philosophy? Their basic response to this point would be to say that all the Indian terms you use for philosophy is not philosophy exactly. It is a mix of philosophy and religion, it is this, it is that, it is not philosophy. And you will see this kind of an argument duplicated across. You will see this in the argument when they say that the idea of reason and rationality is not present in Asian and African cultures because no term, no linguistic term within these cultures give an equivalence to what they think is the meaning of reason, rationality, science, and so on. Logic, again, a very important value-loaded concept for the European modern mind, where logic and rationality were very closely connected to each other. And then you have this idea and these utterances by some of the most important philosophers and people who influence the formation of societies, who say that Asian and African cultures do not have logical ideas of logic in their cultures. Why? Because you do not find equivalent translations for logic. They're saying, show us the evidence of what you mean by logic. How do you, where is logic present in your traditions? So you give examples of thousands of years of very complex work on logic in Indian thought, and it'll always be, yes, that is only one aspect of it, but that's not logic in the way we see it. So why I'm saying this is, in the question of translation, one aspect is just the set of, the source language, target language, etc. The standard questions of translation. The other is the inherent politics of translation. And concepts play an extremely important role in this politics because societies attain value by possession of concepts. So liberal concepts, for example, concepts associated with liberalism, which have certain justifiably very important set of values, particularly in the context we are in today, are seen as value laden in a particular sense, so that when we use those, when you compare societies, you hesitate to allow the other society the capacity to have these concepts. It can range for a variety of reasons. There's a very interesting book by a very important sociologist, American sociologist Orlando Patterson, and I've just been reading that for some reason because I'm in a discussion of this book with somebody. And this is actually on slavery and freedom. And it's important because it is raising this question of the particular book I'm talking about is Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. And Patterson is making a very interesting point, which to me was very puzzling, especially in the context of translation, which is that freedom as an idea, freedom as a concept, is only available in Western cultures. And it's very interesting, how does he make this argument? Because how can you say that freedom as a concept, as an idea, is not present in any other concept or any other cultures other than what he calls as Western culture? The reason why it becomes important, why he's making the point, is because he says slavery is very essential to the development of the Western culture, and therefore, because it was based on slavery, a concept of freedom arises. And it's actually a very radical book. It's not like the colonial discourse book, which would say the concept of freedom is very highly valued, was not present in Asian African culture. What he's trying to say, okay, I get a message saying audio isn't clear. So what I'll do is I'll cut the video. Kiran, is that okay?
No, sir. Your audio is clear now. I think your audio is clear here. I think they have some problem with.
Okay. Then fine. Okay, I'll go ahead with it. Sorry. What I was saying is that okay, I think I just lost one. Patterson on freedom, and what he was saying is that freedom. It's very interesting how he makes his argument. What he is saying? He's saying freedom is not available How does he know that? He's not looking at all this Indian. He's not talking about the various philosophical traditions, the Buddhist, the Jaina, the Vedantic traditions, and the subaltern traditions, which are thematized to it in various ways. He is using the technique of translation. He's using, and he's not looking at Indian content very interestingly. He's looking at certain Japanese thing, and he's looking at the Japanese word for freedom and says, look, this is not really freedom. So this is, I think, for anybody who interested in the question of translation, we have to figure out how we are going to respond to this question of whether cultures possess concepts or not. Do we, as a culture, what I'm using word very culture very loosely here, do we have, as a people, if you like, as societies, as communities, possess the idea of democracy, egalitarianism, equality? Freedom, secularism, etc. So we need to also resist the point by saying, yeah, we have all of this. Whatever we think is of a very high value for other parts of the world, that these are also possessed by all of us. I don't think that's an important point at all. I am interested in, not in answering this question, but asking, if you want to ask this question, what are the intellectual resources? How should we tackle this particular kind of questions? Now, there are, as I said, many other examples where people have been trying to translate these terms, and they are trying to form various kinds of examples of, as I said, terms which are these high value. But we also know, even for terms which are not necessarily valued within cultures, there is a genuine problem of translation. And I was just remembering, other than these terms like democracy and secularism, which do have a genuine problem, there are words. I was just remembering this work by a very important Tamil scholar and writer, Srinivas Ramanujam, who has written recently a very interesting book on renunciation and untouchability in India, where, and as part of, and he's also, I know of his engagement with translation because of his, he has translated our book, Cracked Mirror, Gopal Guru's book, into Tamil, and there were many kinds of questions which he was used to raise to us in translating. How do you translate a particular term into, in this case, Tamil? So one of the very interesting examples he was talking about was of the translating the word untouchability, and the way in which untouchability, as translated into Tamil, is very different from the way the kinds of meanings, the larger semantic space that it has within English. For example, the addition of the negation, the term unadded to touchability, does something in English which does not happen in the many different types of words which he was trying to coin within in Tamil, for example. So what I'm trying to say is, while there are certain concepts which have value, which are therefore used to rank cultures, and we know that the possession is based, the argument for possession is based on whether the language term is, the linguistic term is there or not. There are also genuinely other kinds of problems of translation which come from the structure of language. In this case, for example, a very simple case, just the negation, the use of negation in English is very different, not just the use of negation in Tamil, in many Indian languages. In fact, the negation meanings of it, somebody was telling me that in Tibetan there are 4 different types of negations, which are terms for it. So it becomes an extremely complex question of how you translate these kinds of things. So so this is the larger background. I want to point out one particular way of approaching this question and answering this to some extent. Okay, maybe not really something which might satisfy you, but let me try and set forth a simple argument about how I engage with this question of whether there are words which are direct correlates of certain conceptual terms available in contemporary world today. And as I said, my interest in this, to give you the story of it, I have to go back to when I first started asking this question about translation. It arose in the context of my by asking a very simple question about scientific texts. So, I'm going to take you away very far from your literary, political kinds of social science disciplines into hard science. And I want to propose to you there's something very interesting about translation within the sciences which has not been paid, for which due attention has not been paid to by the translators. Scientific texts are a classic example of texts which need the idea of translation to make sense of them. And yet it's remarkable that translation studies does not engage with scientific texts at all. In what sense do I mean this? So when I wrote my first book, Translating the World, Science and Language, it arose from a very simple question I had asked, which was, how do I read a scientific text? If you open a book in physics, for example, it's a book which is got first it will have some few lines in English, then there will be some mathematical symbols, then there is a picture, there's a graph, there will be a table, and then you have some more English words and some mathematical forms. It looks like, what is interesting about the text is when you open the text, it looks like a multi-semiotic text, right? It is a text made up of different semiotic systems, and language, as we know, is fundamentally a semiotic system. So you have these multiple semiotic systems, which is different types of languages which are present in a single text. So the closest analogy I can give to you is, suppose you're reading a book which is written in, let's say, 4 languages. Particularly, let's say in Gulbarga, you're reading a book which has got Hindi, Kannada, Marathi, and Telugu. So you're reading a novel, first paragraph is in English, second paragraph is in Hindi, third paragraph is in Marathi, fourth paragraph is in Kannada. How do you read that text? What kind of qualities as a reader do you need to make sense of this text? Typically, we would call this as an intersemiotic text, a text which is made up of different semiotic systems. And so I began with this argument by saying that the most important resource that every person who reads a scientific text needs is the resource of a translator. The capacity to move from one linguistic system to the other, or one semiotic system to the other. I should be able to read this one paragraph in English and switch to Kannada and switch to Marathi and Hindi very easily. And for those of us who are multilingual speakers, for us it's not, we can understand how this happens. But scientific texts in principle are constructed in this form. And then what was very interesting for me is, why is it that in the literature on understanding scientific texts and scientific writing, that the question of translation has never been. I'll tell you why. Because when I looked at, well, in order to develop on this, when I started engaging with translation studies in great detail, I realized something very interesting, that people have been writing so much about what are the translation mechanisms for translating poetry, for translating prose, for translating all different kinds of texts. And it is remarkable that there's a great silence about how am I going to be translating scientific texts. And why are they not asking that? And it's very surprising they're not asking that. Because in 20th century, as you know very well, the beginning of the 20th century, some of the greatest revolutions in modern science, in modern physics, for example, begins with relativity theory and quantum theory, and then also in biology after that, and also very important developments in mathematics happens, the first few decades of the 20th century, and these texts were not written in English, including Einstein's, the German physicist writing of some of the most important work on quantum and relativity theory were written in German. Some of the most important seminal fundamental work in these disciplines were written in French, German, and also a lot in Russian. There were very important developments in mathematics which were written in French, because it is a very powerful school of mathematicians from France. And yet, in all this discussion on translation, there is very little you will actually find on the problems of translating these texts. Although these are the most seminal texts, they are equivalent to some of your major texts in literature and social sciences, for example. Why is that? And for me, that was a question which led me into trying to make sense of what is happening in the question of translation. Why is translation quite irrelevant in the context of such? Why did scientists think the questions of equivalence, for example, or questions of free translation, and the many kind of theories of translation for poetry, prose, etc., do not even matter when you translate scientific texts? And there are two very good reasons for it. Let me put it. There are three very good reasons for this. One is that scientific texts are many of these questions, of these theories for which translation was not a problem, had one common language, and that common language was mathematics. So it's very interesting what happens when you translate Einstein's work into English, for example. You can take Einstein's papers and translate it into English, and he has written it in German, and you know how the English counterpart will look? Wherever he has used German words, you will put English, but all the equations and the mathematical structure is completely transposed into your English text. So this, in a very odd sense, translation in that context is not really translating every term, word, sentences, phrases, etc. All the questions which plague what translation really is. Translation in that context is just taking the English words and the German words, the natural language terms, into converted into another language. So from your source language to target language, keep the structure of the mathematical structures the same. And since scientific writing, the language of science believes that the most important meaning is present in mathematical structures and other semiotic systems and not in natural language, the question of translation does not even arise. You know what they are basically saying? They are saying you can drop all the German out of the texts of science texts which are written by all the German scientists. It won't matter to us because, and this is the second point, they believe that natural language terms do not contribute to the knowledge claims of a scientific text. Okay, and this is extremely important. You may think this about science, and I'll tell you an argument why it is exactly transfers to our problems about secularism and democracy and so on. So the two out of the three, what carries meaning is carried over. It is not translated at all in scientific text. You just carry equations. Equations carry the substantial meaning and you carry them over. You don't translate them. And natural language is flawed in that it is not. It is just a carrier of ideas, and by itself is not important enough to worry about translation. So we're not even worried whether you write it in German, French, Hindi, Kannada. I'm just going to do it in that sense. It also, the second point here is that it betrays a suspicion towards natural language, which is always present in scientific texts. And part of the suspicion comes from the problem of translation and other related issues. If there are any questions on it, I'll tell you specifically what kind of suspicion comes in that. And the third point, and that's a point which is of interest to us, is it is this kind of ignoring the problem of translation in scientific text is possible because of yet another deep belief in the practice of science, which is the way scientific concepts are understood. And here is where a very important engagement with translation happens within scientific texts. And that's why I think it's a very interesting way of trying to engage with that particular method of looking at translation in science versus method of looking at translation in theoretical structures in social science and humanities, for example. So let me just very briefly tell you this. I mean, again, if there are questions, we can talk a little bit more about it. And all of this are published stuff, so you can read it anytime or write to me anytime. So I'll give you just one example. And it's a very interesting way of approaching the question of concepts in science. And I think it's very useful for us when I'm talking about secularism and democracy, for example. And what is that? If I look at a term, you might say, a critique coming from translation studies can actually criticize this view of science, which thinks that natural language terms are not important. They don't carry the weight of meaning, and they are secondary to the whole practice of science. And like I argue in the book, that without natural language, it is impossible to have a scientific text anyway, and that's a very different set of arguments for it. But look at what kinds of natural language terms are there, what kind of concepts arise in this. And through this, you can actually make sense of something very interesting about democracy and secularism. Let's take a very simple concept, which I'm sure even as non-science students, you all know very well, because it's a concept from school science, which is the concept of mass. Okay, MASS, mass, matter, etc. The idea of mass is so fundamental to any type of science that you do, whether it's in chemistry, physics, etc. And all of questions of physics arises from looking at mass and famous Newton's laws about mass. Einstein's theory of E equal to mc squared also has the idea of mass. So mass plays a very important, it's a very central, fundamental concept. It's almost like a concept like democracy, if you like. Now you have this concept, and what is very interesting is you could ask the question, how am I going to translate mass if I'm going to translate it into Indian languages, for example? So if those of you who are in science education know this very well. And you know how, for example, as part of my work on this, looking at science translation of science text, I've talked to certain people who work with texts in Malayalam in science text, and you know there are many examples of how they translate that word mass into Malayalam. Many times when science texts translate some of these terms, they just transliterate them. They don't translate them. But what is very interesting is, in the context of scientific text, if you look at the word concept called mass, the word mass will occur in a large number of scientific texts because too many theories are present around the word mass. But you know what is very interesting about it? That very few of these theories of, I mean, very few of the meanings of mass are the same in all these theories of, in all the uses of mass in science. That is, the word mass does not have just one meaning. You cannot say, I'm going to translate the word mass and tell you this is what it is. Because every invocation of the word mass in science has a very specific meaning depending on the theory and the context in which the word mass is used. So, for example, the way mass is used as the Newton's first law is called inertial mass, which is a very different quality of mass. It has got nothing to do with the other ideas of mass. It's a very different meaning, very different property of mass. The second law of Newton's thing is about how a body moves and you pressurize force on it. So it's a relationship between mass and force. Then you have a relay and meaning of mass just to do with gravity. The famous example, two bodies attract each other. Two masses attract each other, and that is a special quality. But science uses the same word mass for all of them. It is not like what we do with, for example, in secularism, we say Indian definition of secularism is that equality towards all religions, and the Western idea of civilization is separation of church and state, or religion and state. And every time we talk about it, people will qualify it by saying, oh, the Indian definition of secularism, the Western definition of secularism, Japanese definition of secularism. And what science does very interestingly is to just use one word mass without telling you. They are not telling you this is Newton's idea of mass, that's Einstein's idea of mass, that's electromagnetic definition of mass, that's a quantum theory of mass. No. Because they very interestingly, for a discourse which is so callous towards about the possibility of using natural language, it knows very well how to deal with this problem of translating concepts by saying, I'm going to use the same word and you figure out its meaning in the context. Don't make a fuss about what word I should be using. And this, remember what this does is it completely liberates your understanding of what the work of translation really is. And I'll give you just one example of that. So to put a summary to what I'm trying to say is that the meaning of a term does not depend on itself, obviously, just in the giving of the word. The meaning of a word depends on the theory in which the words occur. So the meaning of a concept depends on a theory in which this word occurs. So every word whose meaning you're looking for, you have to look for the theoretical structures, the web of other concepts which hold a concept. Now, why would this be important? Because I never translate words. That doesn't make sense at all. It doesn't, I'm not even saying you have to translate, I'm not just saying you have to translate other words and so on. When I say we do never translate words, when you translate a concept, you're only translating a series of other concepts along with it. And this goes back to a very important lesson for the way we translate things like democracy, secularism, etc. And in the last 5-10 minutes, I'll just talk about how this extends to this particular point and what it says about the question of translation. So the first point I think we need to engage with in order to answer these questions more meaningfully, is to go back and ask this question: what are concepts? What is different from the idea of secularism? What kind of words are these terms like secularism and democracy? And if we, in our general usage of the term, we tend to call them as concepts, then we have to have an idea of what concepts actually mean. So if secularism and democracy are concepts, then what do actually concepts mean? Are concepts the same as words? Or is there a relationship in concepts and words, but concepts are not reducible to words? So, obviously, for students of philosophy and particularly philosophy of language and in metaphysics, there is, of course, a huge amount of discussion on what are concepts, what is the relationship between concepts and language, and etc. etc. But I'll just give you one example rather than go into that in detail. That there is one particular view of concepts which fits with much of what we talk about. That every concept is called the theory view of concepts, which is that every concept is actually a theory in itself, a small theory in itself, if you like. So secularism and democracy are not words which are looking to translate into another word. Secularism and democracy they are little theories which are present. So when you're going to be translating these terms, the question you're going to ask is, how do I make visible the theory which is captured by a word called secularism and democracy, which I then translate. So when you're translating secular and democracy, you're translating little theories, and you're not translating words. And what does it mean to then translate these kinds of, how does one actually engage in this question? And then you will ask the question, what becomes right translation, wrong translation? So again, neither do I want to bore you with this long argument, but nor do I want to impose things which I write on you. But if you want to read a much more detailed analysis of this, I can send you a paper called Translation as Method, where I give the many examples and argue about this point. And here the simple point is, when I'm looking at a word, okay, this is a very important point about translation. What does translation actually do? Translation allows us to test what I call as the meaning bearing capacity of a concept or a word. So let's look at just as a word. All words have meanings associated with it. And you have to have an idea how meanings accrue, add to words, etc. Now, the question we have to ask is, what kind of meaning can a concept hold on to? How much can it bear? Can it take secularism and add kinds of meanings to it so that I will then finally argue that fascism is the same as secularism? Does secularism as a concept allow that meaning bearing capacity, or does it break under this weight of putting fascism on top of the word secularism? The point is very simple, and this is, I think, the real foundational issue for me here, which is, if you ask the question, how do meanings attach to words and concepts? Then our standard answer is from dictionary, from this, etc., etc. But a most important way by which you generate meaning, there is no word which has got dead concepts, that is, dead meaning. No meaning is fixed for any word which we use in any language, unless it's a dead language. Anytime you use a word in any context, in any kind of ways in which you do, you are creating new meaning for it. So, use of language is the creation of new meanings for words and concepts. Now, suppose you are in, let's say, the English language and you're using the word democracy. There are various ways to generate meaning. The simplest meaning could have been, let's say, some notion of equality or equal representation. Democracy has gone far beyond the original political ideas of equal representation. Okay, there are different kinds of democracy, different manifestations of democracy in different domains. So what has happened is, democracy gets meaning through its uses within that language, through its very creative kinds of uses within language if needed. And then the very interesting question comes to us is this: What happens when you exhaust the way in which you can get meaning for words like democracy and secularism? So I want to just alert you to one very simple fact. The question of translation is nothing to do I'm saying it a bit dramatically. It's got nothing to do with original target, source language, target language, moving from one language system to another language system. Translation is a method. And this is the argument, that's why I call the paper as translation as method. Translation is a method to create more meaning for a term when it has exhausted its capacity to produce meanings within the source language. So let me explain very quickly without taking any time on this. So I have the word secularism. I have different, there is first of all one meaning of secularism. Just like mass has different meanings in different theories and different contexts, secularism will have different meanings in different contexts. So this Indian idea of secularism, Western idea of secularism is not consistent with the way we understand the meaning of concepts and meaning. So I use the word secularism and I say in the context of certain culture, this is what it means. And in the context of these practices, this is what it means. And then I look at the fundamental act of translation. What does translation do? When I translate it into a word in Kannada or Hindi or Tamil, and in my struggle with trying to capture the meanings of secularism, I discover newer ways of expressing meanings of secularism and democracy in these languages. And these create meaning for the original term in the source language. So my understanding of democracy and secularism increases through translation practices. The meanings of democracy and secularism expands not just by the practice of the source language, linguistic practices of the source language, but by the translational practice when you move from one language to the other. So in other words, translation is not about equivalence and capturing this and that. Translation becomes a method to create more and more domains of meaning. And therefore, in this sense, as I've been saying, what I would call this as, it's really not about languages in that sense. It's really fundamentally about the way in which we understand what meanings are and how to produce meaning of a term. And remember, the production of the meaning of a term is so important. Because value of a particular concept comes because we add that meaning to it. Why does a term like reason has a particular value? It's also a concept like many other concepts. It becomes a particular set of meaning or value which is added to it. A different meaning is added to the word reason so that it has certain kind of cultural value within particular cultures. So when we look at it in that sense, what we are trying to understand of translation, and this is why I'm saying that a very important function of translation is actually captured in the idea of scientific concepts. Because what does the scientific concept, what does scientific writing do? If I take the word mass, okay, this is my last point, I just stopped here. If I take the word mass, okay, if you look at this multiple semiotic text which science writes, all science you will do by saying, let M be mass. That's your starting point of symbolization. That's your starting point of writing. In our school text, you say, let X be distance. Let T be time. Let M be mass. And then you do something with it. You know what you have done? You have done translation there. You have done a very unique kind of translation. I could have used some other word in Hindi and said, let this be mass, let this be time, whatever. I'm not saying that. I'm just using a symbol, but that is a translational act. But you know what is unique about this translation is that first you take a word like mass, which is filled with meaning in the language, and then you replace it with a symbol which is excavated, evacuated of all meaning. M does not have meaning. T does not have meaning. Time has meaning. When the moment you hear the word time, you know all kinds of meanings associated with time. T evacuates meaning. And the whole act of scientific writing is to put in other meanings into this T. So at the end of it, you have a theory of time. You have some new qualities and properties of time. That's really to me a very important act of translation, which is if you look at translation, you remove the idea of meaning first from your source language, and then you fill it with meaning with your target language. So what you basically done is this excavation of meaning and filling it with meaning. That idea of translation has goes back to a very important, very important connection between the relationship between concepts and meaning, and that's why translation, as Madhva Chipli and me have written in a piece, we argue that translation is more fundamental than language. It's prior to language because it has this capacity which is already inbuilt within the idea of language, but that's a different argument. So I will stop here, and I know I've taken you around different types of ideas, etc. But I hope that I've been able to communicate some very basic idea about the richness of translation and particular strategies of using translation as ways to produce meaning in the source language, not in the target language. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Sundar, for a very thought-provoking lecture. We are very happy to listen you. I personally believe that all about learning means a meaning-making process. I think I personally feel that translation is a one thing that will help us to making meaning of the phenomena which we are dealing with. So thank you very much. Now the session is open for discussion. So I think some of questions are there in chat box. So Professor Sundar, will you read and replay the question, or can I read it for you?
No. This one I see Basavaraj Guru.
Yeah.
Question talking about secularism, democracy, the mere concepts was on the candidate. My question is, what should a translator do to make the concepts not only to make them visible but also to make them appear a reality which everyone needs to practice? Okay. Okay, the first point is why I was talking about this is the argument that look, very often we get caught in in unnecessary questions about translation, which is this term correctly capturing it or not? My point about the ideas of translating secularism and democracy, for example, is to be able to find expressions and coin words within your own target language, whichever language you're translating, so that it is able to do the work you want of that concept. So when I'm using the word secularism, for example, there is a particular, this is one particular theory of language itself, right, which is the use value, meaning as the use to which you put a word. And, most famously associated with Wittgenstein, but it's a larger way in which we understand languages. So, for example, if there is a word, let's say justice, even children don't know, for example, fair. Okay, I have seen children who are 5 years old say, oh, that is not fair. And you ask the child, what do you mean by saying that is not, what do you mean by fair? The child is not going to give you a big theory of Amartya Sen who says what is fair and what is equal. It doesn't need it. It knows how to use that word. And many times we use concepts in order to be able to do something with it, learn to use it in certain contexts without necessarily knowing what it means. So that depends on the kind of language in which it is placed. So to me, a very important question we need to ask when we can translate it, for example, say into Kannada, would be to ask what kind of usage do I want that word to have in my language, in my context, in my actions and practice. So as you correctly asked, how to make them appear a reality in that question. If you are making, suppose for you, the use of the word secularism in Kannada is to make it a reality rather than just as a linguistic exercise, then you will coin words for it and expressions for it which will work towards this function. What word is it going to be, rather than these long terms of equality between religions and this and that? What is it that you're going to be using? What term is going to capture my attention, the child's attention? The child which does not know the meaning of the word fair. What does fairness mean? and says, when you tell her, I'm not going to give you a biscuit now, that is not fair. If that's what we want to do with secularism in the social world, we should be able to empower people with the usage of the words in a way in which people will say, I want to be secular. That is a task, and that's a political task of translation. I think we are too much worried about meaning equivalence and linguistic structures alone. We need to look at larger philosophies of language and meaning in order to see how I use these terms, what kind of meanings are associated with this. Okay. Then, in the context of a concept, when the meaning is generated, why does a non-Western? Yeah, okay. This is really the big problem. Why does the non-Western require the approval? Okay, one, this I hope, I mean, this is a very deep problem, and it's a big problem. I tell you why. When people have been, even today, for a very long time in India, for example, philosophy, you could not teach a non-Western philosophy within philosophy departments. You would teach it in other language departments in Indian universities, largely. Things are changing, but they're also changing because of that's a very different, dangerous path also by which it is changing now. But in general, this has been a major problem. In the West, for example, you could have an extremely good faculty in philosophy working on logic, for example. They would still be put in the religious studies department, not philosophy department. The reason why this problem arises is very simple. The reason it arises is for people who are working with English language. For those who work within the other language systems, whether it's in Tamil, Kannada, Marathi, Sanskrit, and so on, they don't have this problem at all because they're able to work within their own terms. The problem for us comes when, suppose, I'll give you this very good example. So when people talked about logic, and when people said Anumana is a term which is used all over, even in Kannada it is used in terms of reason, logic. In Sanskrit there's Anumana. In classical philosophical traditions, Anumana. And if people say Anumana, and then say that is what we mean by logic, then people immediately say, no, that is not what the West means by logic. That's not what we call as logic. But the odd thing is, there is no one meaning of logic even for the Western tradition. There are hundreds of theories of logic, hundreds of types of logic done within Western philosophy itself. So this is a I still think it's a major decolonization project which needs on which concepts get value and which linguistic terms can match that. So this is a bit of a problem, but as I also said in the answer to the question of secularism, we need to know how to use these terms, convert them so that they become politically useful terminologies for us. Then Kumar's question, how do you look at the concept of capital? Yeah, this is very true. It is true for almost every concept. It's very interesting. I was telling you about Ramanujan's translation question, and one of the examples he discussed, and he has sent me quite a bit on that, has been in his own attempt to translate capitalism. And I should put you in touch with him, or I should send you more on that. And he was talking about in Tamil when they translated capitalism. I'll just read this very one example from that, which is true now in many Indian languages, and it tells you how we are stuck in this problem of translation when we are translating concepts like capitalism. In Tamil, he says it goes as Mudalalitwam, in the sense that it becomes capitalistism. So the capitalist becomes central to capitalism. In many of the formulations of the term for capitalism, this capitalist, the translation of capitalist becomes very crucial. And that changes the meaning of the word capital and the word capitalism, because when the moment it brings in the word capitalist into it, then you are not only talking about capitalism as a social process, as a non-human process, it brings the capital as a human agent within any definition, any usage of the word capitalism. So to go back to my point about using terms, so every time I'm using this term with a capitalist present in capitalism, it has very different implications and very different meanings we create in our languages. And as this also illustrates very well my argument that translation is a method, a technique to create more meaning for the source language. So when I look at the Tamil translations, I'm actually thinking about what new meanings I can give to the traditional understanding of capitalism in English. That's the point. And I think that's why capitalism functions. Thing. So social science, you cannot worry about whether we are using, no, whether there are exact similar meanings, etc. or not. We too do very similar to what has been the most fertile aspect of scientific translation, which is evacuation of meaning and then filling it up with meaning. Remove the air from the tire and then put your air into the tire. You approximately will put at the same pressure. You go to a puncture fellow, removes air, puts air, they'll say what is the whatever thing they have, some measure, and they put it. It is approximately that. It's not the same air. It does the same job. It carries your cycle. It's not the same air at all. This idea that translation is dynamic in this sense has, especially also, I'm talking about my main interest is in about translating social science and political terms and so on. And I think we caught in these trying to hold on to the source language meanings of it in whatever sense. In literature, there's been a lot more freedom in doing this, and people have got away with various other kinds of experiments in translation literature. Academic text is still very stilted. You're still caught in trying to say, I'm missing the meanings. And no, meaning is created by a language, the concepts, the theory in which that term arises in your new source language. Okay, if I have one more minute, Simon, this is your last question, I think.
Yeah.
What is it? There are many words which can be translated. Yeah, that's okay. And if so, the translators say that he or she did not do. No, I think real justice is, I don't think the question of real justice, exact equivalence anyway matters to translation as we know by now. And I think we should be far more open towards understanding translation, as I said, in terms of particular linguistic action also, rather than the linguistic equivalence. Okay, there are a couple of more. Kiran, you tell me whether we need to stop now or.
Yeah. Actually, you have 5 minutes, sir. If you want to answer anything.
Oh, I have 5 minutes? Okay, great. If I have 5 minutes, I'll finish it very fast here.
Yeah.
Nivedita says some theorems related to science are seen in ancient texts. Yeah, what are all the things? So there's an extremely important question. What are all the things to keep in mind while translating it and recreating it from a sentence? Okay, I'll give you just one example, a very important example, I think, which is a translation of, translation of Yukti Bhasha. Okay, it's an example of a text which I use in the translation as method paper. Yukti Bhasha is a very important Malayalam text, which people point out as the most important text of Kerala astronomy. It brings together many of the works of the Kerala astronomers and mathematicians. And Professor Sharma has translated it into English, and that is available. And Professor M.D. Srinivas and his colleagues did an extremely interesting translation of the English translation of Yukti Bhasha. What they did was, they took so Yukti Bhasha is written in Malayalam, which are text of mathematics. Extremely interesting text on mathematics, because the argument is that the first examples of calculus comes from Kerala astronomers much before it comes anywhere else. Okay, and this is we know the date of the book, we know the real content of the text, so I don't think that's much of a dispute here. No. Now, what Professor Srinivas and his colleagues have done is to rewrite this text in mathematical language. So what is interesting is the Malayalam text of mathematics is written only in Malayalam. And you can't even see it as a mathematics text. There are no equations, symbols, because equations and symbols which we see in mathematics arise as a much later product of writing strategies in mathematics, which arises in Europe in a particular context. So in Malayalam, the whole mathematics books are written in Malayalam. And what these people have done is to rewrite that in symbolic form, which looks like modern mathematics, for example. So, and you can really clearly see what kind of mathematical ideas are present in that text, what it can say, what it cannot say, the limits of what it is present in the text and what is not. I think, and when you do this, you're actually engaging in a very important activity of translation. So, the point is again, not to claim that this was there, that was not there. It's, I think, quite irrelevant to us now. I'm just saying that your discovery of concepts and ideas depends on the person who's doing the translating. And all that we can say is, you cannot say, I cannot discover these ideas. All you can say is, can you convince me about it? Can you convince me, or is there a rhetoric about it? Can you tell me that, look, that's why I called it as the semantic bearing or the meaning bearing capacity of concepts. How much meaning can your concepts bear? And if I can show it to you meaningfully, then I think that's all we need to do. Rather than just make a claim that, somebody was doing quantum theory, etc. That's ridiculous. But it does not mean that we have not had the capacity for some meaning to be present in different traditions across the world. I mean, it's not just about the Indian ancient or old, it's from subaltern traditions, aboriginal traditions, and so on. Very important, powerful philosophical and scientific concepts are present. What liberty can translate to enjoy or translating? A lot of liberty, of course. And again, I know that many of you are specialists in translation studies, and you know this very well. And Professor Shiv Prakash is also going to be speaking. So, in literature, etc., they've done enormous work. I'm talking with specific focus on academic work and so on. And I think even in translating academic texts, there's an enormous amount of liberty which a translator should enjoy because it's based on the particular theory of translation that I've been talking about. So therefore, there is no perfect translation. There are good translations depending on what work you want the translation to do. So one way to ask that is, why are you doing this translation? For whom are you doing this translation? And my notions of good translation, if not perfect, are actually related to that kind of a question. And if I'm doing it for children, for example, I'll translate it very differently than I'm doing it for adults. So the matching with, not with the original meaning and source type, matching with my intentions for translation also becomes an important point, but that cannot be the end all, but that is a okay. How would we, is there a difference in translating
Professor
student?
Sundar,
Yeah.
Professor Sundar.
Maybe I'll just stop here. There are a lot more questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Sundar. Actually, one of my colleague asked you one important question. I think that is the last question for you. I just read that question, Professor Rajiv Joshi from our physics department. So he asked one question that symbolic language, the meta-theoretic set of concepts is very essential. Does the scientific translation capture them? Existence of symbolic logic, something like that. Mute.
In a culture.
Symbolic logic, etc., are about what you do with those symbolic. First, you take natural language and you reduce it to a symbolic representation, and then you do things with them. You combine the symbols in different ways. And questions of these logical forms, etc., arise in the combination of the symbolic. I'm talking at the level of language in the reduction. You take the word mass, let M be mass, let F be force. That itself, that idea that so Newton's second law, force is the rate of change of momentum, etc., which is F equal to ma, written as F is equal to m times a. That reduction itself is very interesting. And all I'm pointing out at the level of language is that when I do it at the level of reduction into symbol, I first remove the meaning from the natural language terms, and then I do my manipulations, and then fill it back with meaning in a different context.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot more to be said, but I just stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Sundar Sorakai, for being with us. It was really a thought-provoking and very interesting lecture that we listened from you. And so many questions are there. I request all the participants, please, your questions will be considered by our team. We will try to communicate with Professor Sundar, and we'll get back to you through our WhatsApp as well as our Telegram group. Thank you very much. On behalf of Karnataka Central University Publishing House, I thank you very much, Professor Sundar Sorakai, for joining with us and give your very valuable time and discussing with many things with us. Thank you very much. At the same time, I thank everyone.
Some questions we'll reply back.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. And I thank all the participants who joined within India and abroad, and so many places. I thank everyone. Now we are moving to the second session of this particular evening event. I just asking Professor H.S. Shivaprakash, sir. Am I audible, sir? Hello, Professor H.S. Shivaprakash, sir.
Can I call him?
Yeah, I think 1 or 2 minutes he's going to join with us. So we are going to start the another talk of this particular session. My the director of Prasaranga, Professor Vikram Visaji, will introduce the speaker. Uh, yes, sir. Yeah.
So maybe you can talk about the title of the
Yeah.
talk and a little bit about.
Yeah, actually, today the Professor H.S. Shivaprakash is going to talk about culture and translation, a dialogue. I think it is very interesting to listen to him, and he had worked so many, brought so many work on culture and translation and all. So,
Is there, sir?
yeah, now I think Shivaprakash sir joined with us. Sir, am I audible to you, sir?
Hear me?
Yes.
Sir, am I audible
Can
to
you
you, sir?
hear me?
Yeah, yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm audible to you.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, yeah.
Am I audible to you?
Yeah, yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are. You are. Thank you very much, sir, joining with us. I call Professor Vikram Visaji, Director, Prasaranga, Karnataka Central University, to introduce the speaker and moderate this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran, and thank you, Professor Sundar Sarukai. Now we are entering into the third session of the first day. We have with us Professor H.S. Shivprakash. Let me introduce him in a very brief way. H.S. Shivprakash is a celebrated writer, awarded Indian poet, playwright, critic, and translator, writing in Kannada, with 13 books of poems and 15 plays to his credit. He has translated Vachanas into the English, which is published by Penguin Classic Series. Apart from being the trendsetter in Kannada literature, he has been working between Kannada and English from last 2 to 3 decades. Now I request him to deliver a talk on culture and translation, a dialogue. Over to Professor H.S. Shivprakash.
Thank you, Professor Visaji, for having me in this thought-provoking webinar. And I'm also very glad that I am in a very good company. I'm speaking after Professor Rukai, who brought out some very important aspects of translation, which I'm going to take up in my presentation. I'm very happy that Professor Sarukai elevated the concept of translation from being a purely linguistic or literary category to a philosophical and political category. Uh, though I'm going to focus on the translation of what I consider to be literary texts, I'll also be drawing the attention to the broader cultural aspects of translation, because the translation of literary texts does not happen in a political or philosophical vacuum. Uh, First of all, Professor Saruka was talking about some of the words that we use in our discussions these days very widely, and these words are very important. They figure prominently in our discourses. They do not have a history in Indian languages. For example, I was wondering some time ago, what could be the pre-modern Indian word for translation? I could find none. After we entered the field of colonialism, we've been using the various equivalents of the English word translation of languages. In some languages, it's Bhashantar, Bhashantara, which means transposition across languages. And in some languages, it is Anuvada, which can be roughly translated as creating a similar text. And identical text or something of the kind. In Tamil, it's called modifier, changing the language and so on. But all these words came into our languages only after we entered the phase of colonialism. It does not mean that there was no translation happening in our languages. On the contrary, I'm going to argue that our literary tradition, our cultural tradition, was a tradition of translations. There's very thin dividing line between translation and creativity in our culture. But the way we understood translation is different from the way translation was, the concept of translation came to us from the West, and the way we are trying to understand these concepts in the light of the Western translation. In translation theory, for example, as practiced in the West, the translation refers to the transposition of a text from language A to language B, and they call it L1 to L2, from the source language to target language. This is what translation means. But this is precisely what translation was not in pre-modern India. For example, in India, we have various translations of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in most of our languages. And how were these translations done? For example, if we take the example of the Kannada translation of Mahabharata, which part of which I will translate of late, and then in the introductory part of this text, the poet translator Kumarayasa says, "Hidiya ಹೇಳಿದ ಕೃಷ್ಣ ಕಥೆಯನ್ನು ಇಳೆಯ ಜಾಣ ಮೆಚ್ಚುವಂತದ್ದು." He says, "I am retelling the story of Krishna for the pleasure of all the wise people of the world." So for him, Mahabharata is not the story of Pandavas and Kauravas. It's not the story of a battle between good and evil. It's basically the story of Krishna. So the whole concept of Mahabharata has changed. And similarly, when we look at the translation of Ramayana from Sanskrit into our regional languages, here also there's complete freedom that poet translator exercises in getting this language in their own text. For example, these Ramayanas are called Adhyatma Ramayanas. For example, the title of Malayalam translation of Ramayana by Yerupachan is called Adhyatma Ramayana. For him, Ramayana is not the story of a heroic age. It's not the story of heroes. It's a story of devotion. It's a spiritual text for him. So these Ramayanas, which were produced in the Bhakti period, medieval period, were called Adhyatma Ramayanas. And the same word we can apply to our Mahabharata, Adhyatma Mahabharata. So what's happening here? When the translator takes a text from a source language and brings it in his own language, he does not feel the need to be loyal to the source text. Fidelity is the last thing on his mind. He just takes inspiration from the text and creates it as he wants. For example, I can cite the example of another important translation being on India. This is the translation of a Jaina epic, Purva Purana, by Jinasenacharya, which Pampa later translated, maybe a few centuries later, into Kannada, and which is one of the earliest extant poetic texts in Kannada. It's called Adi Purana. Pampa is called Adi Kavi, is a primal poet, first poet. Now, Jinasenacharya's Purva Purana is at least 20 times longer than Adi Purana. Pampa condenses this work when he translates it to Kannada. Just as the Vyasa Bharata is much bigger text than Kumar Vyasa Bharata or other Bharatas in other Indian languages. And there is a very important passage in this Adi Purana, a scene in which Puru Chakravarti, who later became Adinatha Tirthankara, the first Tirthankara liberated one in the Jaina tradition, when he is on the verge of giving up his worldly life, Indra, the king of gods, organizes a dance recital where the heavenly damsel, it is Nilanjana at his court. But when the dance is going on, Nilanjana's time is up and she has to die because according to Jaina, the mythology, gods may live much longer than human beings, but they are also mortal. So her time comes, and the symbol of that, the garland she is wearing, the flowers, it dries up. Indra senses this, but he doesn't want to be any disturbance in the aesthetic enjoyment of Puru Chakravarti Emperor Puru, and he creates in Nilanjana's double through his magical power and the dance technique. But Puru Chakravarti is able to see through this whole facade, and he realizes the transience, evanescence of all human glories, and he decides to become sacrifice. So, well, but the point is, that in the source text of Janasena Acharya, he describes Nilanjana's dance in very few stanzas, maybe less than 10 stanzas. And he describes the dawn of spiritual wisdom in Puru Chakravarti in scores of stanzas. But in Pampa, it's the opposite. He spends more time describing Nilanjana's dance because he's a poet, whereas Janasena Acharya is a monk. So he takes this work, he translates it, but he reshapes the text according to his own taste and his own vision of life. So this idea of translation prevailed in pre-modern India, and this translation is not what is meant by translation in the Western meaning of the term as we derived it. In fact, in Western translation, this is considered to be a minor branch of translation called adaptation. And pre-modern translation of this nature, where there was no textual equivalent, but there was only a kind of inspiration from the source text and bringing about a sea change in the target text, existed in Europe also. Look at Shakespeare's plays. And Shakespeare's plays are based on earlier texts, but they're very free translated. Took from historical texts, took from earlier plays. For example, this Hamlet is based on earlier play by Thomas Kate called Hamlet, and so on. But Shakespeare recreates it freely. But the need for translation, verbatim translation, came with colonialism. This is the time when we started translating the text, when we started using the word anuvada. Before that, our poets don't use the word anuvada, bhashantara. In Chanda, for example, Pampa says when chances are, because the courtier said, if somebody can say this in Kannada, better Pampane, better because they said, Pampa also can say it. And Kumariva also says, Tiriye Herdeva Krishna Kate, here it's a kind of retelling, it's not translating. And with retelling, it becomes a kind of indirect speech. In fact, one of the European literary theorists, Bakhtin, has this very important concept of literary tradition as a series of indirect speech, which means it's not direct speech, it's indirect speech. So when it's indirect speech, the reporter of the original speech is free to add and take out details according to his intention, his taste, and this not only leads to creativity, this also often leads to distortion. So we should try to place the concept of translation as it understood in the West today in the broader context of translation as, I would say, transcreation, for want of another word, because our ancestors did this kind of translation, did use a word for it, Just because we didn't have a word, it doesn't mean that the exercise of translation was not there, the experience of translation was not there, just as before Newton invented a law of gravitation, we can't say there was no gravitation. Translation did exist, but we didn't have a word for it. Now we have to do this rethinking translation. So what's happening between the source text and translation in the pre-modern info is a kind of dialogue between the source text and the target text. The relationship is not a kind of one-way traffic. It's a kind of unilateral transaction. It's a kind of dialogue. So relationship is basically dialoguing as it happens in the case of indirect speech, as it was described by Buckfield in his interview. Now, I'd like to bring another point. I'm talking about the translation literary text. It's good to place the translation literary text with a broader understanding of translation as a cultural category. And the Mexican poet and cultural historian Octavio Paz urges in one of his introduction to his famous book of poems called Renga, which he co-wrote with three other European poets. He says that translation is a broader cultural category because we translate not only text, we translate cuisines, we translate dress codes, we translate ideologies, we translate philosophies. Professor Sarika has talked about the problems of translating concepts in philosophy. So we translate philosophies, we translate ideologies, we translate religions. So those so many kinds of translation. And literary translation is a part of it. And literary translation itself is a very complex affair. For example, I'd like to evoke the typology of translation, which was conceptualized by the great Russian linguist Roman Yakubson. He talks about, for example, intralinguistic translation. For example, the same text, the text can be translated into another text in the same language, in the same language. For example, Charles Lamb's, this book on the stories of Shakespeare's play is an example of intra-linguistic translation. So translation from English to English, but it's an example of what he would call intersemiotic translation. He has translated a play into a story. Just as Shakespeare himself translated the history of North, passages of the history of North in his historical plays like Hickley and Macbeth. So this is called intrasemiotic translation from one science system to another, from the story into the poem. So there can be intralinguistic translations and interlinguistic translations. For example, thinking about what were the texts which were translated in pre-modern India, the scriptures were not translated. For example, it's nobody dared to translate the Vedas until recently. In Kannada, for example, the first translation of the Vedas to Kannada was commissioned by the Maharaja of Mysore in the early part of the 20th century. Till then, Vedas were not sure because this Apurishaya and they try to preserve through exact pronunciation of the text, and the different schools of how the Vedas should be recited, the Rigveda, the Samaveda tradition, Yajurveda tradition, and so on and so forth. So the Upanishads were not translated. What were translated were poems. What was considered Kavya and Puranas were translated. And for the rest, scriptures were not translated. And because these were not scriptures, they had freedom to translate this as they wanted. For example, when you look at the innumerable translations of the Ramayana, sometimes there are translations of Ramayana from what we now consider Hindu kind of framework to Jain framework. We have Jaina Ramayana, Jaina Mahabharata. For example, in the Jaina Rama in Kannada, in the, by this great poet Abhinava Pappa, it's a very beautiful word here. It's not Rama who kills Ravana, because Rama is an enlightened being. He can't kill anybody. So he gives this job to Lakshmana, because Rama is so pure, he cannot engage in an act of killing. So this kind of translation is a translation of from one philosophical background or one ideology to another. So translations, the landscape of translation is full of variety and complexity. We can talk of, as I said, between languages, interlinguistic translations. Within the same language, intra-linguistic translation. For example, in the 15th century, some of the Virashaiva scholars wrote commentaries on the Vachanas of 12th century saints. These commentaries were also a kind of translation, intra-linguistic translation, but it was a kind of intersemiotic translation because they removed poetry of the Vachanas and they tried to convert them into kind of unilateral philosophical text. And then in semiotic translation, if a poem is translated into the genre, the same genre as another poem, then it is in the same semiotic system. But if the poem is translated into a play into a poem, it is intersemiotic translation. For example, a lot of European poets have written poems on Shakespeare's characters. Boris Pasternak has done this. Similarly, the Czech poet Miroslav Volov has a few poems on Shakespeare's characters. So here, the play is being translated into a poem. This is an example, intra-semiotic translation. Plus, there also the translation from one genre to another. For example, this is famous book on poetry and the painting by the German scholar Lessing. It discusses this question: how the poems are translated into painting. There are lots of painting on Shakespeare's scenes. For example, lots of painting in European history based on the scenes from the Bible. So what's happening here? This is a kind of example of intra-semiotic.
You're not audible.
Hello. Hello. Sir, you are not audible. Hello.
You have lost connection or something.
Already?
Because we can please call him.
Yeah.
So just keep the mute. Yes, sir. Kiran, you will go. Yeah, we got him.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, go on, sir.
Now you can start, sir. Now you can start.
Yeah.
There was some. Yeah. Yes. Start.
Hello, sir, you're not audible, sir. Just check your audio, sir. No, sir, you are not audible.
सर चाहे तो इधर भी भेज दीजिए Zipper की.
No, ಅವರು ಮತ್ತೆ ಜಾಯ್ನ್ ಆಗ್ತಾರೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಜಾಯ್ನ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ
ಹೌದಾ
ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಇದು ಆಡಿಯೋ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅವ್ರದ್ದು.
Can I say yeah?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
You're audible, sir.
Oh.
Go on, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm so sorry for this. I was not able to work on my computer. Some call came, so it happened like this. Anyway, I was trying to say that the landscape of translation is full of variety, complexity, between the languages, between the different genres of literature, and between different genres of art. A work of a play into a painting into a poem. A lot of poems have inspired very great paintings. For example, in Japan, some of these Japanese poetry, the work between the genres. The English poet William Blake not only painted his ideas, but he also made poems with his ideas. So all these things are possible. So the number one, the point I made is translation is a lot more than what is understood in the West today. If you look at the example of practice of pre-modern Indian translation, real pre-modern Western translations, and linguistic and literary translation should be part of a broader category of translation. And I would just like to bring in one more concept, which is very important for the understanding a concept in the modern world. This is a concept I borrow from the Brazilian poet and theologian, very modern poet and theologian, Pasquale di Andra, and he says that there is a way in which we translate between cultures, and the word used is the word anthropophobia. Anthropophobia in Portuguese is cannibalism. So the Europeans thought that Brazilians were cannibals; they eat up Europeans, which
very
in
important
fact was
point.
true. The cannibalism
I
was
had read about
practiced in
it.
colonial Brazil. But what he says that when we come in contact with colonizing culture, how do we respond to it? We can't ignore it. We have to cannibalize it, which means we eat it up and digest what we can, and we spit out and vomit out the rest. So this is what is happening within cultures. When Europeans translate it out, okay, this is what happened. When we do that, this is what happens. We take from the source text what we want,
I have
and sometimes this act is conscious, and most often is unconscious. And this translation happens between which happens between languages which have less power than with languages which have greater power, and in the context of colonialism, this kind of cannibalism happens either from the colonizer's viewpoint or from the viewpoint of the colonized. So there's no the well on the possibility of translation. We can out that the translation is a very complex activity, and it has to be understood not just as matching the source text with the target text, but as a kind of dialogue between languages, between cultures, between genres, and also in the context of unequal politics of the modern world. So with these words, I stop here. I hope I have not exceeded my time. I'm sorry for the interruption in between. So if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No,
Thank
no,
you.
no. I mean, I can answer
Thank
your
you. Thank you
question.
very much, Professor Shivaprakash sir, for your enlightened.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now the session is open for discussion. Right now we have one question from Basuraj Donur, Dean of our School of Languages and Humanities. Can you take the following question? The translator's job is not merely to translate the SL text word by word, but put it into the TL text, but also to catch the spirit of SL text and express the same into the TL with the equal force. When we do it, don't you think our job is to make sure that the meaning of the SL text is not politicized in TL.
Do you agree with the statement?
Do you agree with the statement that Indian translation has not freed itself from politics?
The meaning of the word, the meaning of meaning is political. The meaning is not given, the meaning is created.
Let me check, sir.
So, the translator brings in without meaning. So, Sarukai also talked about how translation actually is an act of creating meanings. This happens in literary translations also. So, it's not a given meaning, but we create new meaning according to our requirements.
Yeah, this is another important question. I feel one question we have that can you reflect on the translation hurdles you faced when the translating Bhakti poetry?
See, basically, the languages are translated from Kannada to English, and the linguistic structure, the two grammatical structure is very different. Kannada is one of those languages where the nominals come up, the adjectives come after the noun. They're post-nominal, the linguists call it, and Kannada is pre-nominal. English is post-nominal. So how right branching and left branching languages is called. How to translate one linguistic structure to another. And also some concepts. How do we translate the word bhakti? So the bhakti word comes repeatedly in the Vachana. How do we translate this? It's not devotion, and it's not just love of God. So what are, so these are some of the, how do we translate the word Sharana? It's a culture specific word. Sharana is not a refugee. Sharana is not somebody who surrendered. So sometimes I have to retain the same words, and I have to footnote it. Sometimes I have to find the near equivalence depending on the context. For example, one big hurdle I faced was to translate the word ayya, which is a repeatedly used word in the address in the Vachanas. And the earlier translators, including Ramanujan, conveniently left them out. But the word ayya is very important. It has different meanings in different senses. It means success, sometimes it means father, sometimes it means strength, and so on. And because that is very important because language of Vachanas is dialogue, it's not monologue. They always talk to somebody, to God, to human beings, to things, and so on. So these were some of the the problems I faced while translating Vachanas. If I can, these are what I remember at the moment.
Yeah, we have one more question from Parimala Kamta. Sir, it is said that when the translate a text, we translate the culture of the text too. Does it happen in the translation of poetry? That's one part of question. Another part of question is, and A.K. Ramanujan says that poetry dies translation. You can comment on this statement.
So what does A.K. Ramanujan say?
He says that poetry dies in translation.
He said it, why he said it? Because he himself was a very famous and very accomplished translator. And sometimes poetry gained in translation, it comes to life in translation.
Next to go to
Some very bad poems can be translated into very good poems in other languages. I don't believe in this myth that translation is lost, meaning is lost in translation. Poetry is what is lost in translation. I don't agree with it at all. A lot of poetry comes into being through translation. This is my feeling.
Another
And
question.
what was the one? I think I answered that.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. We have one more question from Dr. Suraj Kumar. Sir, can you elaborate the inter-Semitic translation with reference to literature-based cinema?
Yes. Of course, when you translate, for example, Dr. Zhivago, who's passing forward, was made into a movie by David Lean. Is an example. Interesting what he translated. Lawrence is very his lover. A novel was made into a film. It was like when Satyajit Ray made the Patel Panchali, Vishnu Bhattacharya's novel into a film. It's again an example of interesting translation. And when Kalidasa translated Shekuntalopadhyayana, one of the sub-stories of the Mahabharata into a full-fledged play. That is also an example of inter-semiotic translation.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Do you think that translation lost its scope due to technology? Dr. Nagaraju N asked this question. What do you think, sir? I mean,
What technology? If one means,
yeah. Do you think that translation lost its scope due to technology? I mean, modern technology, which I think he is referring to that,
Yeah.
like Google Translation, something like that.
no, I don't think so. It is of, if you know how to use it, it can be of great help. Sometimes I notice I've been translating a lot of Spanish, Latin American poetry, and the poets can be English translations. And sometimes to get the meaning of, I know a little bit of Spanish, so to get the correct meaning, I have to refer to Google Translate. So by referring to Google Translate, I can tease the meaning out of the line than from the translation made by bad human translations. So if you know how to use technology, it cannot, it would rather be a great tool in our hands than a kind of obstacle.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. We have a last question here. Narayan Swami K asked this question, sir. How could a translator deal with a situation where he knows for sure that a particular concept has been misinterpreted by the author, and if it is set right in translated work, the very core of the original work may sound contradicting to the rest of the elements of the original work of art?
One more thing I could cover in my presentation because of the limitations of time. In literary translations, we are not
This question is
reinterpreting
also good.
Last.
because
Dilemmas.
in the literary work, the meanings are mostly affective meanings, not rational meanings. The question of interpretation comes when you're dealing with rational meanings, in philosophy, for example. In literature, for example, the famous Marshall poem, silent pond, the frog living in splash. Of course, there are 25 translations of this haiku poem in English, but here we are trying to recreate an experience. It's not a question of interpretation. So it depends on how much of rational meaning the text, source text has, and how much of affective meaning it has. For example, I translated William Blake's poem Tiger. Here, I'm not trying to interpret, I want to create the effect. In the modern translation theory, it's called the equivalence, affectual equivalence. The translated text should be able to create the same impact as the source text. It's not a formal equivalent. For instance, written in the same kind of rhyme or meter, which cannot be with a different language or different kind of meter. It has to create the same kind of aesthetic impact.
Because we have a time.
So when we are doing literary translation, I think
7:20.
it's more of
You can continue.
imbibing the aesthetic essence and translating into the target language than interpreting it.
We have 20.
But when that sense affecting the problem comes, when we vachinas, there are also rational meanings. Then the question comes of how I have interpreted it. And how I have interpreted the text themselves. For example, A.K. Raman's vachinas have reduced the dialogic text into monologic text. If you are trying to translate vachana, language of vachanas into the language of his contemporary English poetry. So, which according to me, is a kind of a violation of the source text. Whether it's good or bad, I don't know. But it takes away some of the very important political meanings of the source text, according to me.
Yeah. Nilima Singh have one more question, sir. How do you decide on who your reader is, especially while translating into English?
I am my own reader.
Okay.
So, Tulsidas said he composes poetry, Swamta Sukhaya, for his own amusement, for his own fun. I do that. And it also gives is fun to some other reader, I'm very happy. So I don't think of my readers when I translate. I translate from myself, but there is a reader in me also. When I'm translating, when I'm speaking, there's a listener in me who's listening. When I'm writing, there's a reader in me who's reading. I have to satisfy that reader within me.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
One more question.
Another question, Prashant Malur asked this question. While translating from LI to L2, there are many words with symbols which can be interpreted or perceived in a different way. What do you think the role of translator here?
The translator we
L1,
can't
L2.
create
L1,
exact
L2.
equivalence. We can create near equivalence.
Okay.
For example, uh, the word God in English with capital G, it cannot be translated. We don't have semantic equivalence of it in Indian languages because our God are got with small g. So what do we do? Because the difference between Christian theology and Indian spiritual
This question.
philosophies.
This question.
So one has to create a near equivalent, and there can't be one solution.
Yeah.
Every time this word occurs, so Saruka was saying for physics, when the word mass appears in different contexts, the meaning changes. So here also, when these words, for example, linga in vachanas, one of the oft repeated words is linga. But linga in vachanas is not the same thing as linga in Tamil Shaiva poetry when they are referring to Shiva in the temple. Vachana poets refer to Ishtalinga, not always. Sometimes it has a more philosophical meaning. Allama Prabhu says, Linga Vimbodo Ondo Anukyale Hesaru. Linga is the meaning of something unimaginable. So, how the same word Linga changes its meaning according to the context, according to the speaker, that has to be. So, we have to listen to the source text carefully. Listen to it. Don't try to interpret straight away. Listen, 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 listen. Let it speak to you. Particularly when you're translating pre-modern text, don't translate into a modern category. Listen to what they are saying. They may be saying something more important than what you think is important.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. We have one more important question from Manipuri folkloristic. Dr. M. Sadananda Singh asked this question. In Manipuri Ramayana, translated from Bengali version in 18th century, we find multiple aspects of negotiations between Hindu culture and traditional Manipuri ethos and sensibilities. Moreover, some episodes are also found modified following the cultural and literary traditions of the land. Sir, can we consider or call such kind of works as transcreation rather than translation?
If the word doesn't matter, what I'm trying to plead for is to extend the meaning of the word translation to include all these different possibilities of translation. And I said because the textual translation takes place in the context of cultural or philosophical translation. For example, when Vaishnavism went to Manipur from Bengal, the Vaishnava, the incoming Vaishnava religion was translated into the categories of native religions. So the compromise that was worked out between Vaishnavism and native religion. Because a lot of Manipuris, they also go to Krishna temple, but they also have their local tsunami deity shrine in their house. So that's the cultural context of it. So the textual translation conforms to the same processes of broader cultural dialogic engagement with other culture in the context of such as Manipuri history.
Yep. Thank you very much, sir. One more question we have. Is adaptation different from translation? I would like to know in the context of your adaptation. Mahendra asked this question. Mahendra M. Navodaya. Yeah.
Adaptation is a minor aspect of translation. What I'm trying to argue if the translation itself is one of the streams of adaptation. For that broader word, whether we have the word
It's the same
adaptation,
thing.
Yeah.
but let's define what
Maybe you
we
can ask
mean by it.
as last question.
Do we mean only translation, verbal translation, verbatim translation as understood in the
Dr.
West?
Mangala Kumari.
Or do you mean the broader concept of
So there
translation
is someone with
as
the name Dr. Mangala
adaptation
Kumari.
or translation, as in the context of pre-modern, modern Indian and European practices? So the words are always contentious, but I think we have to be clear about in what sense we're using the word. I'm not dictating that a particular word should be used. Whichever word we use, it should include all these different possibilities of translation. This is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. One question is there. Dr. Mangala Kumari asked this question. I think it is my question also. Sir, what are the different difficulties you found with the translation of vachanas?
I've told you some of them. Translation the addresses, for example, I like Ayya. And what do you do with the Ankitas? And Ramanujan translated, for example, a lot of Lord of Meeting Givers. It sounds very good in English, but I don't know because some people have questioned this because they say it's a kind of colonial way of translating it. I myself asked Rama why he did that, and he says, see, if I put Purasangama, then the English people can't pronounce the word, they're mispronouncing, and it breaks our heart to hear them mispronounce it. Then I said, then your name should also be translated Ramanujan. You have translated in English, you have translated your name as the younger brother of the handsome one. Rama means Rameti the Rama, handsome one. Anuja means younger brother of the handsome one. That's how you should translate your name. So this is what happens. So how do you translate these Ankitas, the signatures into the English? Sometimes they are proper nouns. Pura Sangam is a proper noun. I keep it like that. Chandamalika is a proper noun. Keep it like that. Sometimes they are not proper noun. We're talking about qualities. For example, Madana Dureya, the cobbler has an Ankita, Kama Dhuma Dhureshwara. It's not a proper noun. So I translate this as a lot of lust, dust, and smoke. In fact, my next book of Vachanas, which is I'm preparing for publication for quite some time, is going to be named The Lord of Lust, Dust, and Smoke. So it depends on the context. Depends on the
Thank you so much.
specific context or the word, specific connotations of the word.
We'll thank them.
And there is a common noun,
Please
there's a
announce
proper
the
noun,
session.
or whatever it is.
Tomorrow's.
So these were some of the, and also, for example, Vachana, repetition is very important. But in modern English poetry, in English language, this repetition doesn't sound very good. And if you give up the repetition altogether, it becomes prosaic. And if you retain the repetitions as they are, it becomes boring in the English. So one has to negotiate between these differences, not only between the languages, between the poetry culture of the languages.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just a second.
Thank you very much, sir. I think now the questions are over now. So thank you very much for being with us for the long time. We are very happy to have you here. I think we had a very wonderful discussion today evening with Professor Sundar Sarakai and Professor H.S. Shivaprakash. I thank both the speaker on behalf of Central University of Karnataka and the Prasaranga CUK. It was very delightful academic conversation that we had today. Thank you very much. I thank all my colleagues who are here up to this 7 o'clock of evening, and the participant who are participating across the country as well as some people from abroad. I thank everyone. Thank you very much. By my special thanks to Professor H.S. Shivaprakash. He joined from the beginning and he was staying up to this time. Thank you very much for your valuable time. And I just have one small announcement to make. So tomorrow morning, our session starts sharp at 10:50. Professor Vanamala Vishwanath is going to speak on translating Indian classics across culture. That is a topic. Another speaker, Dr. Rogio Usham, Theatre of Translation in the context of Manipur. He's also joining from JNU. I welcome you all for that session also. Same way that tomorrow evening we have a very interesting session. We have a Dr. Estherine Kire, poet and writer. She's joining us from Norway. And another important speaker tomorrow evening, Dr. Ele JP, Head Department of Political Science and Sociology, Royal Bhutan University. He's also joining with us tomorrow evening. I request all the participants join for these two sessions of tomorrow. Morning 10:50 the session starts and evening session start by 4:50. So thank you very much for being with us. It was a very good time that we had. Once again, I thank Professor Sundar Sarokai and Professor H.S. Vishwanath for their wonderful, Professor H.S. Shivaprakash for their wonderful thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Congratulations to you all.
We must congratulate you, sir.
Yeah.
It went well, actually. Everything.
That was very good. I never expected it would get this much of
Clarity and all, participation and all.
I think 100%.
Yeah. Madam, we will do. Don't worry. We will do.
YouTube पे भी जा रहा था.
Yeah, जा रहा था. Live
YouTube
था.
also. But
So
tomorrow,
can I close this?
हाँ,
YouTube?
सेव कुछ करना है?
सेव हो गया.
हो गया ना?
रिकॉर्ड हो गया.